Hello again, and welcome to another installment of recent reading. And probably should have done this video a few days ago. I'd been a little fresher in my mind after finishing this book, but I think I'm still close enough to it that I can get through this pretty well. I have already started reading my next book, probably 70 or 80 pages into it. So I guess I'll just really quickly mention that the next book that I'll be doing is Stephen King's Gerald's Game. I was actually looking for a particular Stephen King book that I think that I own, trying to find it for a friend who wants to borrow it. And I stumbled across 3 books that I had bought and had never read. All brand new Stephen King books to me. Of course, the one that I read for this video was brand new, but anyway, although I'd really love to continue with the Dark Tower series, like really bad, I'm not going to be able to buy those right away. So I have Gerald's Game, and then I'll have Dolores Claiborne and Rose Madder to read, all ready to go. But anyway, I'm just projecting for the next few months what I'll be reading and what I'll be reporting on in these videos. But this is the book that I read that I'm going to be talking about right now. The lighting's probably a little weird because it's a dark room and it's at night. But anyway, this is Hearts in Atlantis, and I finished this up, I guess probably like Friday or Saturday, and today being Monday. This was a really good book, although it wasn't really an actual full novel from start to finish. It was a collection of stories that all loosely tied into one another. I didn't know that, honestly, until I was a little ways into the book, and I was looking up online about the Hearts in Atlantis movie that they made with Anthony Hopkins in it, because I based the first story of this, I based it all around seeing Anthony Hopkins in the role that he played. Even though I haven't seen that movie, I just remember the previews for it. And then when I found out that the whole entire book wasn't about that story that's in that movie, I was like, oh, well, that kind of came as a shock. Anyway, there's 5 stories in here. And as I said, they all kind of tie into one another, mainly because of characters in each story. And they all sort of revolve around the characters from the first story in it. The first story in the book was called Low Men in Yellow Coats. It was my favorite of the stories. It was a look at the life of a boy named Bobby Garfield from the early 60s. And his friendship with John Sullivan and Carol Gerber, and his very uneasy relationship with his mom, who she was not a very nice lady, and went through a world of her own turmoil. But of course, we're looking at the story from the point of view of her son, so it was hard to, in my mind, it was hard to be sympathetic to her, despite what she was going through, despite the fact that Bobby still loved his mom, even though you kind of saw the relationship disintegrate through that first story. I don't want to spoil every last bit of each of these stories, but I will probably give away spoilers, so as I like to say, there's going to be spoilers ahead. Click off the video if you don't want to hear anything more. But if you're still watching this now, then, let's proceed. Bobby Garfield was this kid who lived, like I said, with his mom. My brain just kind of went flat as to where, I think the first story took place in Connecticut or something like that. I could be way off, but it was northeast somewhere. And Bobby and his mom lived in this apartment complex. And he went to school, and he had his friends, as I mentioned before. Carol and Sully John was what they called their friend John Sullivan. He was just referred to as Sully or Sully John. And they were your typical, just preteens, 10, 11, 12-year-olds or whatever. Growing up in that time period, one of the things that everything I read about, every critique, every review of the story was, wow, Stephen King did an amazing job telling tales that take place in the 60s. And I was like, okay, I was born in 74, so I didn't get to experience any of the 60s firsthand. I only have what I've seen on TV and in movies and, kind of what I've heard from people. So, it just felt like, if this story was being taken place and they would have said it was 1980 or 1990, I would have bought into it. But, if this was a good depiction of the 60s, then bravo for Stephen King. But I was just transported to this kid's world and to his unexpected friendship with this older gentleman that moved into the apartment complex that he and his mom lived in. A fellow by the name of Ted Brodigan, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, because in the book, in that story, Stephen King made sure to relay the fact that Bobby's mom purposely called him Bradigan all the time. So I believe that it was just supposed to be Brodigan. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's this older gentleman who moves in with, just a scant amount of items, mostly bags full of books. And between his books and his insight on these things, and the fact that even though Bobby wanted a bicycle for his birthday, his mom gave him a adult library card allowing him to check out books that a kid his age normally wouldn't be able to check out. He started to draw a lot of, I guess like courage and whatnot, and meaning in these books that he read, both from the library and from Ted. And that's probably not a super important thing to delve into in this video, but it's just something that stuck out. We're constantly referencing Lord of the Flies. Once he read that book, he realized it was really, really important, and it seemed to tie into the story. But the thing that really struck me was Ted, and some things that he said and some things that he did. Now, this little collection of tales was written in 1999, and I've been reading the Dark Tower series, which the books themselves started back in like the early 80s and or maybe even the late 70s. I can't remember. And they carried all the way on up until just a few years ago. And because I didn't read those stories until more recently, I didn't realize how many books over the years had ties into the Dark Tower series, and how like the Dark Tower series itself is sort of the crux of all of Stephen King's work. It's sort of the center. It's sort of the gravity in which every other book revolves around, which is just an amazing thing. I don't know that any author out there has ever written a lot of books. My light source in the background just faded away. But I don't know that any other author has written so many tales over the years, so many books, and had so many of them tie into one another. It's pretty amazing in my opinion. But even this book, which just seems like a little blip on the radar, for Stephen King's overarching tales, and yet Ted, from that first story in this book, goes into these little trances, and we find out later on in the story that the reason why he does is because the low men in yellow coats are near and they can sense him, but he manages to block them out by forcing his mind into going somewhere else. And at one point during one of these trances, one of the first trances that Bobby ever witnesses, he said something in the book that just blew me away. I wouldn't be able to find it here, especially now in the dark. But to paraphrase it, he basically said the words that are spoken so many times in the Dark Tower books. All things serve the beam. And when I read that, I was like, are you fucking kidding me? I was just blown away. I was like, even this random book, this book that I'm pretty sure was bought by my ex-wife when we were married, and she read it, and she was confused by it. But she said she enjoyed it, but she didn't really know what was going on. Had I read this without having seen, or excuse me, without having read some of the other Dark Tower books, I might have been lost too. Because by the time that story ends, it's been mentioned a few more times, but you don't know exactly what it means unless you've read the Dark Tower series, and then you know exactly what it means. This is another character involved in that story, and I've read something and spoiled something for myself, but Ted himself shows up, I think, at some point in one of the latter Dark Tower series books. But Low Men in Yellow Coats book ends, or the story, excuse me, it ends, and it's actually kind of sad and kind of a negative ending, with Bobby Garfield not really having a good outlook on the future. It doesn't seem like things are going all that great for him, although it's narrated, I think, kind of from the point of view of Bobby 20 or 30 years in the future. And then, of course, in the last story, you get more Bobby, which was really, really nice. It was a nice way to wrap up all the tales. But the first tale was the one that really stuck with me the most. It was the one that meant something the most to me. I was really hoping there would be a glossary here so I could just glance at it easily, but the next story in the book, I guess I'll just look it up here. Once again, always prepared am I. In the next story, or the second story in the book, was actually entitled Hearts in Atlantis. And at first I was a little disappointed in the second story. Maybe it was the dawning realization that I wasn't going to spend the entire book with Bobby and Carol and Sully and Ted and all that story. Instead, I jumped to the story of a guy named Peter Riley, some guy who's in college in 1966 in Maine, the University of Maine. And it just seems like, where did this story come from? What does this have to do with anything? You have this kid who's in college, and there's very little about college, like schoolwork, going on in the story. In fact, they spend so much time talking about how they played Hearts, this card game that I don't know if this is a fictional card game or if it's the actual Hearts that I know of. But all these guys in this dorm or whatever in this school spend all their time in this one semester playing Hearts so much that none of them study, and almost all of them fail, and it's the craziest things happen. But the point of the story seemed to be a little bit more on the side of touching on like the Vietnam War and how people started to be, activists against it, and some of them jumped on the bandwagon without really understanding what was going on. So it was, I guess it had a voice of some sort, and it was telling a tale. But then you're introduced to a female character in the story, one Carol Gerber, who was in the first story. And you're like, oh, okay, well now I guess I understand how this ties in, because now we're seeing her perspective a few years later. That was the thing about it that was most important to me. I could really give a shit about Peter Riley or any of his buddies or anything. The only other character besides Carol herself who was interesting was a guy who went by the name of, god dang it, Stokely Jones. Is that it? Stokely Jones, who is this guy who was physically handicapped. He had to use crutches to get around. He was very excised by the other students, just like Very rarely did people talk to him. Nobody seemed to like him. He was very, very abrasive, but he was an interesting character. And then Carol's story was interesting. I wanted to know more about what had happened with her. At the end, or near the end of the first story, Carol had kind of split away from Bobby. Bobby and Carol basically were each other's first boyfriend, girlfriend experience. And I really rooted for him. It's kind of ridiculous to think about it. As young as they were, young love, that young, is not usually destined to be a lifelong romance. But I really, really eat up the stories of the unusual guys who get the pretty girls, the ones who understand them. They find happiness with somebody. Even if it's a character in a book who's 11 or 12, I want to know that they spent the rest of their life together and had a wonderful marriage and kids and grandkids and all that. It didn't happen that way for them. It was sad, but I at least wanted to know what else had happened with Carol. And she had actually ended up dating Sully John for a while, and was still together with him when she went to college, but she ended up getting involved with this Peter Riley, and then she had to leave college. She started to get into the Vietnam activism stuff, and she got in with some bad people doing some bad things, and then that kind of was left up in the air. This story was, like I said, it was just whatever. I was just glad to see Carol. I was glad to get to know an interesting character like Stoke. That brought us on to the third story, which was called Blind Willie. Blind Willie was centered around the guy named Willie Shearman, who was actually a character in the Hearts in Atlantis story. He was one of the college kids who went to... No, I'm sorry. He wasn't one of the college kids. He went to Vietnam. He was one of the kids see how it's confusing, even though the connections between the stories aren't major. But he was one of the kids who beat up Carol in the first story. They were from like some sort of a Catholic school. He was the nicer of the three kids that beat her up, and I just read the story if you want to really know exactly what's going on with that. But he goes to Vietnam. He's in Vietnam with John Sullivan and Ronnie Malenfant, I guess that's how you pronounce his name, who was a character from the Hearts in Atlantis story. Malenfant was one of the characters from the college with Peter Riley and all them, was one of the people who was playing Hearts all the time. These three people, in their connections, end up in Vietnam, and some heavy shit goes down in Vietnam. And Shearman gets saved, and he ends up... The story kind of takes place in, I think, early 80s. Yeah, it's in 83. And he's serving out his penance for the things that he's done in his life, particularly the incident with Carol. And he has a strange, double or even triple life. He has an apartment, he has a wife or a girlfriend or something. He gets up and he goes into town, and he goes into an office building, and he looks well-dressed with the suit and the briefcase and all that. And he goes into this office and locks up the door with 3 deadbolts, climbs up into a ceiling panel, and changes his clothes or whatever and his look up there, and looks more like a worker who goes out and about in the town to do service calls or whatever. Exits out of another office, talks to other people in the same building who don't know that he's this other person, he has this duplicate station in their office building. And he goes out into the town, and he goes to some random hotel and goes into their restroom, their public accessible restroom, and then he changes himself to look like a beggar on the street, and he begs and bums money off of people and actually does an amazing amount of money there. Pays off a cop who's on to him but lets him go because he's getting money. And all the while he's doing all this stuff to basically serve his penance for what happened to Carol on that day. And the story kind of ends abruptly. You don't know what's really going on. It was weird, but it was okay. I mean, it was different. And then the next story was called Why We're in Vietnam. And yeah, this is the reunion of John Sullivan, Sully John, and another Army officer that he served with in Vietnam named Diefenbaker. And they're at the funeral of another person, and they're talking and thinking about things, recalling things from Vietnam. And Sully John, it's really hard to even think of what name to call the guy, but he talks about how this particular incident in Vietnam had changed him. They'd all stormed into some town, and some old lady had come out, and one of the guys literally knocks her down and then pierces her with a bayonet and kills her. And Sullivan continues to see images of this lady for years and years and years afterwards. And on his way out of town from that funeral or whatever, he's caught in a traffic jam of sorts. And the weirdest scene I could think of that could happen in this movie happens. He gets out of his car, and things start falling out of the sky, and things are hitting vehicles and other people. People are getting killed and destroyed. It's mass chaos. It's craziness. And apparently he was just having some sort of a hallucination or whatever, but actually what ends up happening is he has a heart attack and dies in his vehicle. So he may have just been seeing all this stuff as the heart attack was setting in, and he dies. And it was just kind of a strange, probably very symbolic type entry into the book, but I thought it was a little unusual. Sully John was probably my least favorite of the three, of Carol, Bobby, and him. And he was actually kind of out of the picture during part of that first story, so I never really felt like I had a connection with him. So when this story happens, I was like, whoa, okay, whatever. And then the last story, very short, it was called Heavenly Shades of Night Are Falling. And it's Bobby Garfield returning back to his hometown to attend Sully John's funeral and to meet up with somebody, which turns out to be Carol, because through the other stories, you weren't ever really sure what had happened to Carol. You knew that there was an incident where some people died because a bomb that her activist friends had planted in a building that was supposed to go off when nobody was there didn't go off when it was supposed to. And then when it did, people were there and people died. And her group, or at least the last few people of the group, were on the run for a long time. A bunch of them died in a fire after a shootout. It was believed that maybe Carol and this other guy had died there, but she had actually made it out. She managed to reinvent herself, the brand new name, a new life and everything. But she manages to come to Sullivan's funeral since they had dated after she and Bobby had had their relationship when they were super young. And she meets up with Bobby for the first time in years and years and years. It was a nice story. It was a nice little tiny story that also played back into the story of Ted, who, like I said, was involved in somehow with the Dark Tower and all that. He had been taken away near the end of that story to serve the Crimson King, who is, I assume eventually in the Dark Tower series is going to be revealed to be one of the evil focal points of whatever grand scheme is in play for the Dark Tower series. But he basically kind of directed them back together and sent them a message through his own special ways. So the book ended itself definitely giving me a lot to look forward to in the future when it comes to the Dark Tower series. Like, I want to see Ted again. Although I want a story of Ted, Bobby, and Carol, because they ended up being my excuse me, my three favorite characters from this entire experience in this book. Anyway, as a collection of tales, this is pretty good. If somebody wanted to, I guess, soak in that 60s vibe that everybody praises this for, then it'd be a good book to check out. But you might be super confused. And I know I probably went on a lot longer in this than I expected to, but whatever. This was a very interesting book. I mean, I can't say that the book itself is my favorite book of all time. It doesn't rank up there with the Dark Tower series or The Stand or a lot of the other books. But it was really, really good, and some of the characters in it, they're going to be special to me for a long time to come. And I guess that's what really amazes me. So anyway, I really enjoyed it. Hopefully you got something out of my endless ramblings about this. I also want to go back to Gerald's game. Since I've already started to read it, I wanted to mention that it's a book that reminds me a lot of Misery, which is a really good book and movie that Stephen King did. It's one of these tales of somebody who's stuck in some sort of a situation. It's not we went to the school, or we went to over here, or we took this long journey across an epic countryside or something like that. It's this lady handcuffed to a bed in sort of like a vacation cottage that she and her husband go to, and she's tired of the bondage stuff that her husband wants to do. Apparently he doesn't take her protest seriously. She ends up doing something to him that causes him to have a heart attack. Well, I say that she does, but I mean, anyway, he dies, and she's handcuffed to this bed someplace where nobody else is really around. The key is on the other side of the room. Pretty soon she's having to deal with a stray dog who's so hungry that he actually comes in and starts munching on her dead husband's body. It's very tense, and for me, it causes a weird kind of anxiety that only a person like me, I guess, could have when reading a book. I think it's going to be an interesting book, but I think at the end of it, I'll be so glad to be done with it, because I don't think I care much for that tension in a story. I want a story more like these. I want a story more like Dark Tower, and I don't want one where I have to read for 200 pages or so of someone being trapped in a bedroom, and how do they get out of that, and how do they survive it. Still, I'm sure it's going to be fun. I'm just going to be so spent when it's all over. Alright, well, I went on long enough with this. Enough is enough. I'll see you next time.